Welcome. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. For those of you who like to take travels, maybe you want to put a little inspiration or perhaps a pilgrimage into your experience. Joining us on the program today is author of the book, Call of the Camino. He'll be talking about this wonderful westernmost point of Spain where people like to take that particular pilgrimage to experience miraculous transformations that can only happen on such a journey. I'd like to welcome to the program today our guest, Mr. Robert Mullen. Robert, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, explain why there's so much interest in the pilgrimage to what is known as Santiago de Compostela.
The pilgrimage itself is about 1,200 years old now, so the people that are doing it now are not doing it probably for the same reasons as the ones who did it initially. But if you were to ask this same question to any group of pilgrims that you picked out at random, you'd probably get a different answer from every one, and that gives a clue to why the Camino still has a great popularity, because it has adopted itself, it's evolved, and it's possible for a great variety of people, for a great variety of reasons, to walk it, and somehow all find it a very positive experience.
Now, this was originally a Christian religious undertaking, but it seems that it's really opened its arms, as you just said, to people of all backgrounds.
Yes, if you think about the way people used to prepare for it as opposed to the way they prepare for it today, you'll see the difference. In general, if you were doing the pilgrimage in the Middle Ages, you would have to go to see your village priest first of all. You would make a confession of your sins. You would convince him that you intended to commit those same sins no longer and that you wished to be forgiven for them by walking to Santiago de Compostela and appearing before the altar. The priest would write down your sins. Presumably in those days, the average pilgrim wouldn't have been able to write them himself. So he would have written them down on a document which he would have given back to the pilgrim. The next instruction would be to settle all his debts in the village, if he had any. After that, preferably, he would forgive any debts that were owed to him, so that he would leave the village, set off as a pilgrim with a clean slate. There was one other thing that he had to do. He had to bring his wife, and before the priest, he had to say how long his wife would have to wait should he not return before she remarried. So he cleared that slate as well. Then he was able to set off. He was given, usually by the village, a stick to walk with. He would have already had an overcoat of some sort that would keep him dry during the day and would be his blanket at night. He was instructed to take a wallet, but not to close the wallet. The wallet hung around his neck, and it was meant to remain open as a symbol that he was willing to share what he had, as the other pilgrims were meant to do, with each other. If his burden, if he walked under the weight of his sins, today I think it's fair to say that most pilgrims walk under the weight of their excesses. So the first thing they would do is probably join a fitness club or start exercising regularly, start walking regularly, buy a high-quality rucksack, put some phone books in it, and start walking with a weight on their back, and maybe learn a little Spanish in the bargain. They would then take an airplane to wherever they were going to start. Many of the British pilgrims and the North American pilgrims as well start in France at the foot of the Pyrenees and take off from there.
Now, people come together by chance from all walks of life from around the world, and it seems they have a common shared experience here. Tell us about that.
The first thing you experience is that you leave the life you're used to. You're giving up everything that you're used to in that life. As I say, you have to have a rucksack, and you take with you only what you can carry in that rucksack on your back. So most of your possessions are going to remain at home. And you'll soon find that whatever role you played at home, whatever you were at home, matters a lot less once you set off on the pilgrimage. There are sayings that go with the pilgrimage. What they say today is not the same thing again as they said in the Middle Ages. One of the first things you'll hear on the Camino is, El Camino nos desnuda. The Camino strips you bare. It strips you of most of your possessions, and it does strip you of whatever you were at home. People are going to be a lot less interested in whether you were a lawyer or a banker or a plumber. What they'll be more interested in is what you're like when you're tired, when you're wet, when you're feeling fed up with all that walking and all that mud and all that snow or whatever it is that you've run into.
I think what's exciting about that particular experience is the fact that it really doesn't matter what you believe your social status is or what you have or what you own, that in the end we all get grumpy. We can all feel nasty when we're wet. We can feel elated when we've accomplished something. So we all see that our range of emotions, although may seemingly be experienced differently by the individual, are very common. It's almost like we're all the same.
Certainly you are in your physical setup there. You're staying in, if you're walking as a what they call a true pilgrim, not staying in hotels or going in a car or going with automobile backup. If you're walking with your rucksack day after day, you'll be staying in pilgrim refuges, which are basic accommodation. They're very cheap. So they do also attract backpackers, as you can imagine, or kids out of school that want a cheap holiday. But for the most part, those people soon drop out of the process. The pilgrims then will be sleeping in dormitories with bunk beds. They're usually unisex dormitories. The rules now in Spain are that at least they have to have separate washing facilities and toilets, but everything else is pretty much unisex. So not only are you giving up your social status, in many cases you're forgetting about your gender as well. You may have an upper bunk or a bottom bunk, depending on who gets there first. You may be sleeping only a few inches from somebody else on the floor on an exercise mat in a church tower, which is what they now consider one of the pure refuges, because, again, going back to the Middle Ages, a bed then was a room, a large room in an inn, which for the poorer pilgrims, which were probably most of the pilgrims, meant straw spread out on that floor, and you just found a place in the straw wherever you could, and that's where you slept, and you had no idea who was going to be beside you, who was going to join you, and so that everybody would have to move over a little bit in the middle of the night. And in some of the refuges, it's pretty much like that today, especially in the summer when there are more pilgrims and larger groups of pilgrims coming through. You may be sleeping on a porch and moving over at the last minute, moving your mattress over so somebody else can fit in as well.
Now, it's understanding that the Apostle St. James has his bones buried on the Camino. Tell us about who he is and what that signifies.
St. James was one of the apostles. He was supposedly a cousin or a distant relation of Christ himself. The story got started about 800, during the time when Spain was mostly run by the Moors. They had conquered most of the country apart from a thin strip in the north of Spain. The monastery in Cluny in France had great success with relics, as many of the other monasteries began to do. They attracted pilgrims, they attracted money, they attracted business. And the story started to be spread about that St. James had been the apostle who was sent to Spain to preach there. That is not in the Bible, but it's also not in the Bible that St. James went anywhere else or that any of the other apostles went to Spain. So therefore, it's at least feasible, if not documented in any real historical way. Later it said he went back, St. James, after preaching unsuccessfully in Spain, particularly in Galicia, in the northwestern corner of Spain. He returned to the Holy Land. He was beheaded by Herod in Jerusalem. His few disciples saved his body from being fed to the dogs outside the city wall, put it in a marble sarcophagus, and floated that out to sea, across the Mediterranean, through the Straits of Gibraltar, up to Galicia, where they managed to land it on the shore, carried the body from the boat onto the shore, laid it on a rock, and at that point the first miracle occurred. The miracles of saints, as you probably know, are what happens after they're dead, not before they're dead. So you judge whether someone is a saint by what happened after he's gone. In this case, the rock softened, cradling the saint, as if holding it in his arms, and that was one proof that they had a future saint on their hands. It was another 700-800 years before anything was ever made of that, before the story actually started to be told widely. And at that point, then, pilgrims began to make their way across northern Spain. which was useful for Galicia, which was a poor part of Spain and one of the few Christian parts of Spain left, so that armies or knights coming to fight the Moors would first make the pilgrimage, and that would give them the impetus to go on then with the saint on their side to fight against the Moors. And little by little, of course, the Christians in Spain managed to reconquer the country, often with visions of St. James on a white horse charging ahead to lead them against the Moors, who had as their emblem the arm of Muhammad. And it was thought before the Christians had St. James that that's why they were losing, because the Moors had this arm and the Christians didn't have anything. And besides, their priest told them they were great sinners, so that's one of the other reasons why they were being overrun by the Moors.
Now, Robert,
that's how it started.
Yeah. Now, Robert, I was going to mention, it seems like just like Haight-Ashbury in the 1960s San Francisco, that the Camino seems to be taking on, I guess, that same allure, if you will, that as a person walks this path, that, as you said, they tend to experience miracles on the path rather than from the saints. What was your experience, and how do you foresee the future of the Camino Trail?
I think you're absolutely right about that. One of the things that set me going, and I think most pilgrims would have a number of reasons for doing the Camino. For the particular audience that I believe this is going to, it might be interesting to know that I did it when I was 60 to mark my 60th birthday. And I was by no means the oldest on the route at the time I did it. There were people well into their 70s doing it as well. In the early days, the miracle stories all involved these relics of the saint, and the active ingredient was the saints coming down to help pilgrims in trouble, in one sort of trouble or another. These days, the story has changed. It's the Camino that appears in the Camino lore, as in the Camino strips you bear, or as in the Camino will end up repairing you. The Camino always has surprises. In each case, the Camino, which really translates into the experience of the Camino, that's the active ingredient. That's what's working on you. And what's working on you as well, of course, is your own effort that you're putting into this. And even for the younger pilgrims who may be reasonably fit to start with, it's still a stretch to be walking 15 to 18 miles every day. And because you're doing it every day, and then because you're with the other pilgrims in the evening, people that you met for the first time when you began the pilgrimage probably, but whom you then see day after day if you're walking at approximately the same rate and staying in the same refuges, eating in the same restaurants which have the pilgrim menus in the town. And a pilgrim menu, by the way, means that you eat at 7 o'clock instead of 9 o'clock like the Spaniards prefer to eat in the evening. Mm-hmm. You're mixing with these people, you're exchanging stories, and because of your fatigue and the kind of mental state it puts you in, you're open to a lot more than what you would normally be open to in the life that you've left behind, at least for the moment. This is a time out for you. You've got a chance to rethink the stories that you tell about yourself, the reasons for the way you are, and you compare this with the way, and you compare who you think you are with the way other people react to you. I should say, usually when I give any talk on the Camino, I start with a disclaimer, and I say that what I'm going to tell you is, and this is what you asked me, what I experienced. Again, if you were to ask 20 pilgrims, you'd get 20 different sorts of experiences depending on what their previous experience was, depending on what their expectations were, depending on what they'd heard about the Camino, and also depending on the luck of the draw. As you also said earlier, you decide, you hear something about the Camino, you decide, gee, I'd like to do that. And there's people all around the world doing the same thing at the same time. You don't know them, they don't know you. You decide, you check the flights, you make your preparations, you check your flight schedule to see when you can go, and you set a date. Again, in other countries around the world, people are setting, just purely by chance, the same date. Well, these are the people that are going to share the pilgrimage experience with you. It's a handful of people which will grow and decrease because some people don't walk the whole Camino at once. They'll do it for a week or two at a time when they have holidays. One of the advantages, I might add, of doing it when you're older is that you can do it all at once if you're retired and you're not tied to the time that your kids are out of school to do it. So you don't have to do it in the summer. You can do it in the spring or the autumn when there are fewer people on the Camino. And if you're older, there'll be more people your own age and fewer kids who want to stay up late at night. Old people, for the most part, if 50s are old, people that age when they do the Camino tend to be in bed about 9 or 9:30 if they've walked 15 to 20 miles that day and know they have another 15 to 20 miles to walk the next day.
Sounds quite intense, that's for sure. Robert Mullen, thank you for joining us here on the program. The book is Call of the Camino. Anything you'd like to add in closing?
Yeah, well, when you get to Santiago, there's a few ceremonies that take place that are extremely memorable. There's a huge censer called the Boto Fumeiro that they swing in the church, initially because pilgrims, when they arrived in Santiago, had to carry out an all-night vigil in the clothes that they'd walked in, which you can imagine weren't smelling particularly sweet by that time. These days, you go and you check in at the pilgrim office. You show them a document called their credential, the pilgrim passport, which you've had stamped at various places along the way to show that you actually have walked the route that you say you've walked. You then get a certificate to say that you've completed the route. You go to a pilgrim mass in the cathedral, and you'll hear the priest read out the names, or not the names, but the origins of the pilgrims that have reached Santiago that day. So you might turn up at the pilgrim mass, be sitting there, and you'll hear there was one pilgrim who arrived today from Portland, Oregon, and suddenly you realize, gee, that's you. But then for many pilgrims, the real hard part begins, because you do have to return home again after that. And home will be more or less the way your home was when you left it. If you're going back to a job, the job will be more or less the way it was when you left it. Whatever the situation is, it'll be more or less the same. There's another saying then that the true Camino begins only when you reach the end. What that implies is that the Camino has done you no good unless you've learned something from it. And the challenge now is to be able to somehow incorporate into your life when you return home what you know now that you didn't know before.
Sounds miraculous just by itself to come back to home and have different eyes to see the world that you were looking at before.
That would be the ideal.
Robert Mullen, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
You bet. Thank you.